It's Tuesday, the 6th of December. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Matt Warman, Labour's Angela Eagle, writer and academic Dalia Gebrial and Camilla Tominey from the Daily Telegraph. Today...
No one knows the full truth. We know the full truth.
Harry and Meghan are about to reveal details of life inside the royal family. The government has dropped mandatory housing targets for councils, so will enough homes be built?
And now we have a planning system which will ensure that we can meet our overall need to get more homes for young people.
I think that everybody has an idea of what they think a barrister is, and I don't often think it's me.
A new documentary looks at the British class system, but is class a big political issue?
Winchester College has a rowing club, a rifle club, an extensive art collection.
Whenever he attacks me about where I went to school, he is attacking the hard-working aspiration of millions of people in this country.
And should the government allow a new coal mine to be opened in Cumbria? Let's start with Harry and Meghan. The Netflix documentary is going to begin on Thursday. It makes a number of the front pages of the newspapers. Let's have a look at The Sun. Netflix fakery storm, Sussex lies and videotape. This is about it containing footage unrelated to Meghan and Harry, although it is about general press intrusion. The Daily Mail has fury at Sussex's Netflix claim of war on Meghan. Very clear where those two papers stand. The Independent has a different take. I was terrified. Prince Harry calls out feeding frenzy over Meghan Markle relationship in full Netflix trailer, on the subject of which two trailers have been released by Netflix. Let's get a flavour of it. Let's have a look.
No one sees what's happening behind the closed doors. I had to do everything I could to protect my family.
When the stakes are this high, doesn't it make more sense to hear our story from us?
It's really hard to look back on it now and go, what on earth happened?
No one knows the full truth. We know the full truth.
Let's start with you, Camilla. You've watched the Royals for years. You're plugged into what goes on, or at least some of it. Is this going to be a significant moment? Have they got something to say?
I think they've already said what they've had to say. I mean, I think people are scratching their heads a little bit and wondering what's left to divulge. The trailers are obviously interesting because on one hand they're trying to fight against mis and disinformation, and yet there are some inconsistencies with some of the footage. Equally, he talks about a feeding frenzy, but as you can see from the front pages, this is creating more of a publicity storm, the kind of storm I thought they'd left the royal family to shield themselves from. And I think there's some perhaps inconsistencies with this comparison between them and Diana, Princess of Wales, because actually in the post-Leveson era, there aren't really any paparazzi following around royals in private moments. There haven't been for at least a decade. I can't even think of a covert pap shot of Harry and Meghan that has made it into the British press. I think there's still some organisations in Europe behaving badly, and actually, weirdly, by comparison to the mainstream media, the internet continues to publish with impunity. But this comparison doesn't quite sit right, because actually, in a way, compared with the Diana era, the royals haven't enjoyed more privacy, but yet these are royals who are now, with this documentary, I guess, invading their own privacy to tell their side of their truth. But there are two sides to every story, right?
But one of the claims that Harry makes is that there's leaking, that there are stories that are planted deliberately to hurt the Sussexes. Is that true? Is that what goes on, Camilla?
Is there leaking? I mean, there's briefing on all sides, including the Sussexes.
Are stories planted?
Are stories planted? Over the course of time, I would say there have been occasions where, certainly, if you look at his childhood, both William and Harry complained about stories being planted against them to better project and promote the Duchess of Cornwall, as she then was, the Queen Consort. And there was talk about the kind of spin and black arts that are often operated in politics, right? This kind of Machiavellian spin machine that goes into overdrive. I think in this case, I mean, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, right? The Sussexes come out with claims. They then brief on the back of them with their own PR people who are not inconsiderable. I mean, they had Sunshine Sachs, a very formidable PR firm in the US, on their side the entire time they were married, and the Palace spin machine. And then there are sources close to the royals that say things. Also, there are sources completely outside of all this that might brief different things into the press because they've been party to the couple's behaviour.
Well, that is context. Dahlia, what do you think? Do you think they've got something to say, and do you want to hear it?
Well, I think that the reason that we hear so much about them and why we're hearing more now is because they have been on the receiving end of an unimaginable amount of headlines. The British media cannot stop talking about this couple. And I think in that context, it's obviously understandable that they would want to put together their own side of the story and put it out there in a way that reflects their experience of the reality. And one thing that was said in the trailer that wasn't in this particular the particular clip that we showed was this idea that this was about race, right? And I think I have to completely agree, because oftentimes in Britain we think that racism only comes across in the form of, for example, racial slurs or like really explicit racist language. But the kind of unbelievable scrutiny and double standards that Meghan was held to. I don't know what this woman did to require the amount of hatred and punishment that she has had from the British media and from the royal family. And when you look at the kind of innuendos that we used to talk about her, you know, I just don't trust her. She's angry. She's an angry black woman. She's uppity. She's entitled. She doesn't understand how we work. These are all ways of marking her as an outsider. And we have seen that essentially as soon as they got married.
Do you agree with that, Angela, that assessment?
Well, obviously there are tensions, and they're now playing out and selling a lot of newspapers and filling a lot of front pages. So you never like to see sort of family dynamics work in that way, even if it's right in full view of everyone. I'd prefer everybody just to leave it alone and let them sort it out themselves, to be honest. I think there's a lot more important things that we need to be dealing with in this country than that kind of a soap opera.
Do you want to hear more from Harry and Meghan?
I just find the whole thing deeply unedifying, really. I can't imagine turning on the new Netflix documentary, really.
You're not going to watch it?
It's just not something for me. But there is clearly a huge market for it, and this is clearly fueling it.
Response, Camilla, to what Dahlia said?
Well, you know, the recent headlines have been because they've created them. I mean, I wouldn't be writing about it if they didn't come up with these 2 trailers and a 6-part documentary.
Well, I mean, they've been the
there's
focus
nothing else
so
to
much
write about
before the documentary. It's been relentless for the past several years.
Yeah, because they left the royal family and issued a statement saying that they wanted to seek financial independence in the US while also representing the Queen. The Queen turned around, the late Queen at the time, and said, no, you can't do that. And then ever since they left for the US for a quieter life, apparently, all they've done is made a load of noise.
I haven't heard a single, in all of the press coverage and hullabaloo that we've seen, I have bet it's only recently that we have actually seen anything coming directly from them. It's all been a media frenzy and a narrative surrounding them. We had a whole news story about the fact that someone made someone cry in the lead up to. I mean, I've never planned a wedding, but I thought someone crying was just a standard part of the process.
Sorry, let's just set the record straight on this. It's all come from them. It's come from them with an Oprah Winfrey interview on prime time. It then came with an Apple Plus interview. It then came with a Spotify series. It then came from Meghan with her Archetypes podcast.
So she's not allowed to. You just want her to disappear and stop and just take it all lying down.
I'm saying you're the one who's surprised by the headlines, and I'm saying if they weren't putting this all out there, we wouldn't be covering it, would we?
But the scrutiny precedes that. The hyper visibility and the obsession with Meghan and Harry happened from the moment that they were married, before when they were still very up for being part of the royal.
Well, there's always interest in members of the royal family.
Yes, but it's
very the same with William and
disparaging.
Kate.
It's very the coverage.
Well, not all the
time.
Can I just ask, was it all motivated, do you think, as you see it, negative press coverage by racism?
I think what happened was that, much like with Diana, Meghan was initially really popular, particularly with social media, which the royal family has less influence over. And that was seen to undermine the hereditary position of the crown, which is William. and race was the lowest hanging fruit to cut her down with, in the same way that misogyny was for Princess Diana.
We're going to move on, but I'm just going to give you this piece of news. If you've been following the story, the Conservative peer, Baroness Michelle Mone, is taking a leave of absence from the House of Lords to clear her name over allegations about her links to a firm awarded contracts for personal protective equipment during the coronavirus pandemic. Now, the news emerged actually in the last hour or so as Labour prepared to force the government to release records relating to the awards of contracts to the company PPE MedPro. Reports denied by Baroness Mone have suggested that the peer may have profited. Lawyers for her have consistently denied any role or function in the company, and her lawyers have said she is not connected to PPE MedPro in any capacity. Let's have a look at this on the front page. The Guardian. The Prime Minister backs down on housing goals in face of pressure from Conservative MPs. Nearly 60 rebels have pledged to back a plan to ban or drop mandatory targets in England. The Housing Secretary Michael Gove has now offered councils more flexibility over meeting the government's set targets. Two of the Tory MPs who put pressure on Rishi Sunak to back down are Bob Seeley and Theresa Villiers, and they wrote this joint piece in the Daily Telegraph. Our house building agreement with Michael Gove will help deliver the community-led planning system we need. The government's just caved in, haven't they?
Well, I think they've listened to a sufficient number of MPs, and the fact that the Tory party has been having a row about planning is much as the Tory party has been doing over planning for a number of years.
Where do you stand? Do you think that these house building targets should be mandatory?
So I think there is a real tension between MPs such as myself, who come from big rural areas where it's obvious that we need more houses, it's obvious that there is huge demand for more houses,
right,
and MPs who come from rural areas who say this is simply not. There isn't the democratic consent for this from my constituents, and trying to resolve that tension is the nature of having a broad church. What I would like is a planning system that actually functions. I don't think targets are a necessary part of that, but if they help, I'd have been happy to see them come into force.
But I mean, what does it say about Rishi Sunak's authority? I mean, you get 60 rebels against mandatory house building targets, which you said homes that are desperately needed. You've got a target of 300,000 a year. You're going to hit it?
Well, I think the answer historically is probably not, and if this house-building target would have helped, I would have absolutely 100% supported it. But I think the most important thing here is, look, these are genuinely felt beliefs on the part of these constituency MPs.
Right, so you give in every time there is a genuinely felt concern by a couple of Tory MPs.
It's the nature of democracy. It's not good leadership to simply try and force people to do things that they don't believe are in the interest of their constituents.
Well, look, the Labour Party said that they would actually support the government in the vote on this, in the bill. We could have got it through if Rishi Sunak hadn't been so weak that he was going to give in to this kind of not in my backyard attempt by his own MPs to stop him reaching these house building targets. We could have got this change through the Commons. The Prime Minister chose to let those people who are on housing waiting lists, young people who can't get access to their own houses and their own living areas, many of whom are paying massively increased rents with no security, can't start a family, as house ownership plummets. He didn't do anything about that. He took one look at 60 of his own MPs and turned round and fled.
What's wrong with councils? What's wrong with councils having a bit more control over house building in their area? They know best.
Well, part of this is that there is never, you can never please everybody with planning applications, especially for housing. If people enjoy, particularly in areas where there are shortages, rural areas, they want things to stay the same. Many people are already there. We've got to have a planning system that actually balances the needs of young people for a home. I mean, a home is a necessity. It's not a nice to have. And actually, there's a great deal of damage being done to our society because people can't get access to affordable housing, and the social sector has declined. We've got 1.5 million people on housing waiting lists.
The figures are very clear, and it's been a failure of successive governments.
But the Conservative government actually said in its manifesto that it would do this. It's now ditched its manifesto. They're not going to reach their housing targets. This need for a necessity, your own secure home, is going to be let go again until we get a Labour government that's actually going to do something about it.
We could have the partisan argument about the Tories inheriting the lowest number of house building
Well,
starts.
let's talk about why Rishi Sunak did this particularly on the political side.
So I think the more interesting argument has to be about how do you get a functioning planning system, and rows about housing targets are a part of that. Of course they are, but they're not sufficient to fix the issue.
Is it, and does it underline Rishi Sunak's weakness, Camilla, over this? That's what the government wanted.
Well, I mean, often a Tory Prime Minister's opposition is within his own party on the backbenches, right? I mean, that's historically proved to be the case. I think with house building, there has been a bit of a shift. I think you could look back to Tory voters being quite NIMBY, and I think they've actually become more YIMBY because they see the need to accommodate their children and grandchildren nearby, right, in the Tory shires, which are traditionally quite expensive places to live. Equally, I think there is a legitimate concern about any legislation that almost gives too much power to central government to issue diktats to councils where developments could be in inappropriate places, and also give too much power to developers. You know, this land banking situation that's gone on for far too long and has actually stopped developments from being pushed forward, I think is anathema to the public. Equally, I think the public are concerned about figures which suggest that there are 238,000 empty properties, and I don't mean properties that are on Airbnb or second homes, but actually empty properties that could be redeveloped. And the whole brownfield versus greenfield argument is a compelling one. Why build on the green belt when there are quite a few brownfield sites that could be
these targets aren't about building on the green belt.
But nobody's ever met targets,
these targets aren't about
Labour
building
didn't
on the
meet
green
its targets.
belt.
No one's met its targets since Thatcher sold off the council houses.
But
Labour and Tories,
the mandatory housing targets are not about green belt versus brown belt, and they're not about more effective use of the land that's been bought and land banked. The Conservative Party has had 12 years to do something to discourage property developers from land banking.
Genuine question,
At the same time, they've also taken many donations from property companies during their time in office. And I don't think those two things
Why didn't Labour meet its targets either? Why do successive governments of blue and red not meet their targets?
Well, what's interesting here is that this is what the government wanted to do. That's what it was committed to do, but has decided, for whatever reason, not to push ahead or dilute the target of making them mandatory. Is it a vote winner or a vote loser, house building? Yes, NIMBYism versus people wanting to have homes that their children and next generations could afford.
I mean, we are in a position right now where the number of households that are threatened with homelessness has increased by 10% in the past year. I don't understand anyone that can look at the situation that we're in with the number of unhoused people who are struggling, which is only going to get worse in the cost of living crisis, and not want to urgently do something to ensure that those people are housed. And I think I completely agree with the land banking question. Essentially, our housing system is a casino for the very wealthy rather than a system that is actually supposed to house people. And I think once again, we are being governed at the mercy of internal battles within the Conservative Party, and it's everyday people that are suffering as a result of that.
Let's talk about class, because a new BBC documentary has investigated how young people from working class backgrounds can secure jobs in Britain's elite professions. Let's take a look.
It is worrying that I might not be the traditional, barrister. Sometimes I think, oh, am I cut out for it? I don't talk like them. I haven't come from where they've come from.
You watch the media, like TV, and they always say, like, if you've got a northern accent, you're so much less likely to get into these things. That's going to sort of pull you back. Like, I sort of feel like the accent that I've got sounds a bit stupid.
Let's talk to my colleague, BBC presenter Amal Rajan, who made this documentary. Hello to you, Amal.
Hey, Jo. How are you?
What did you learn making this documentary about class?
Wow, quite a lot. Several things. I've been thinking about this stuff for 20 years, but I learnt a huge amount in the 3 years that we've been making this particular series. One thing is about the different types of social mobility. So Catherine Bearable-Singh, the very impressive head teacher, who's now the boss of the Social Mobility Commission, or chair of it, talks about how we often focus on rags to riches stories, but actually there's a lot of movement in the middle, and that also counts as social mobility. Second thing I'd point out is the importance of geography. I mean, you heard some voices there from people that we followed from rural Somerset or Hull or Mansfield, and I realised the extraordinary privilege that I had growing up in London, which is where, frankly, whether in Westminster or here at the BBC, a lot of elite professions are still very, very much concentrated here. The third thing would be there's some quite innovative thinking going on. I don't endorse any of it, but it's quite interesting, some of the new ideas around new laws that you could initiate to make class a protected characteristic or give people a legal right to work experience. And the fourth thing, which was in that clip there, is just the strength of feeling that people have paranoia about their accents. And just to be really clear, this isn't something that we projected onto these young people. It's something that separately and independently they came to us and said, as you heard there, they have an absolute paranoia that their accent is going to cost them. And in fact, you know, the programme's been on air overnight on the iPlayer. I've had emails all through last night and this morning from people, subject line accents, who feel very strongly about it. I'll just read you one of them, if I may. This is subject line accents this morning. Someone I don't know, I've never heard of her, met her. Dear Mr. Rajan, thank you to you and your team for raising this issue, accents, which is close to my heart. In the 1980s, when I was at university, an Oxbridge graduate professor told me I would need to lose my northwestern accent if I wanted to get on in healthcare. Whilst I've had a relatively successful career, the impact of such comments on people can be huge. You raise a subject that is very much part of the north-south divide and levelling up. Another message, just wanted to say, saw your doc in the class evening, really loved it, particularly the accent conversations. I got emotional watching it. It's something I've been trying to vocalise for a while. So regardless of whether or not accent bias is real, and we commissioned some interesting research about the prevalence of received pronunciation, which actually the BBC and Lord Reith are quite responsible for the spread of, a lot of people from, especially not from London, spend a lot of time thinking about their accents and how it might hold them back.
Well, how interesting. Obviously struck a chord there. I mean, briefly, you've also talked to people who are in the top jobs. What have they been doing, if anything, to take action to sort of promote class equality?
Well, the big thing that companies... There's loads of institutions that are doing a huge amount. BBC's doing a hell of a lot. There's institutions in finance, in the law, that are doing a lot of what they call outreach, trying to get people who wouldn't think that they might fit in a particular profession, basically going to them and saying, hey, you might well fit. That's tricky in some professions, like medicine or law, where you do just basically need a level of education which not all people have. But it's interesting that there is a limit, I think, to what individuals and institutions can do. And actually, all the people who work in social mobility are increasingly coming to the view that it might need something much more fundamental, whether it's education reforms, whether it's these new sorts of laws that people are talking about, to try and make a solution that works for the whole country. Because these piecemeal ideas, endless good, well-intentioned people, whether it's me or you, Joe, there's a limit to what individuals or indeed institutions can do.
Amal, Rajan there. Thank you very much. Matt, is class a big political issue?
Yes, I think it is. But I mean, I've always felt very uncomfortable talking about class because on the one hand, my dad was a sheet metal worker, my mum was a nurse who became a teacher. I was the first in my family to go anywhere near a university. But at the same time, all of their aspiration, all of their earnings went into sending me to the school that they thought would help me in the future. Now, I don't know where that means I sit from a class point of view, but I didn't stand up and do the selection speech when I was standing for this job to say I'm the son of a sheet metal worker. But I do think what came
quite well in the Labour
what did come across throughout my upbringing was that comment about fitting in as a barrister. I know that I didn't have the conversations round the kitchen table, the dinner parties that opened my aspirations and my horizons. And I think that's why class is such a nuanced conversation. It's about your own personal horizons as much as it is about where you went to school or who your parents were.
What do you think of what Matt's just said? I mean, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yes.
Uncomfortable talking about it, the background that he came from, went to a private school, that was seen as aspiration.
I mean, everyone has their own way, don't they, of having to get through these things. I have a similar background, although my dad's not a sheet metal worker. He was actually in the print, and my mum was a dressmaker, and I was the first person in my family, along with my twin sister, to go to any kind of university, and that was Oxford. I was lucky to get a good comprehensive education. I didn't go to a private school, but my parents, because they were working class and aspiring, said to me, you can do whatever you want, be whatever you want. And every time I showed any interest in anything, they got me a book about it. Very, very supportive. There's a lot of aspiration in the working class. But what we've seen is actually a closing of a lot of those, the ways through that were there when I was growing up have closed off and shut off. And the professions and access to jobs that pay more that get you up that social scale have closed off and become much more sort of public school orientated, which makes more people want to send their kids to public school because they think that's the only way that they'll get through. We've got to open things up. We've got to make certain, for example, that all of those sort of work experience programs, that doing internships, which only people who've got money at the moment that can afford to keep their kids in London or whatever for 6 months doing an internship and making all those commitments, they've got to be opened up. We've got to look at ways through, because our country is full of fantastically talented people in all walks of life that never get a chance because of the region they come from, their accent, what their educational opportunities are.
Is class central to politics?
100%. And I think it's really important to think about what class is. Obviously, you know, there are class markers, so things like accent, but also class is a very material thing. I think in my generation, intergenerational wealth is everything. You know, when it comes to, for example, buying a home, I think it's like 50% of first-time buyers had a significant help from their parents, which implies that their parents have a level of wealth to pass on to them. And whether or not your parents have asset wealth is everything when it comes to your outcomes. The ability to take on unpaid internships. And I think this documentary focused a lot on very elite, like, finance jobs. But actually, in things like the creative and media industries, we are seeing basically no representation of people who don't come from wealthy families. And that has an impact on our culture that is very detrimental. For example, in media, 14% of people working in the British media went to private school. That's double the national average. That has a corrosive impact on our culture.
And isn't that a problem, Camilla? A very small percentage of the kids in this country go to private school, and yet they are very heavily represented in professions like the media, the law, medicine, probably.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it is, a problem. You could look back a generation and say that a lot of people who are represented in professions went to grammar school rather than secondary moderns, right? So, I mean, I'm automatically labelled posh because I'm called Camilla, even though my grandfather was an immigrant ice cream salesman and my maternal grandfather was a Yorkshireman and a woodwork teacher, right? But my dad was the first person... I know, isn't it just? Irish-Italian, it's a heady mix. But I mean, my dad...
on the wrong side of you.
I know, especially with the ice cream. But, you know, my father was a NHS GP for years and years and years, and yet I consequently, I guess, have been raised to be a different class to my grandparents and my great-grandparents, and that sometimes happens. I don't think we should be pejorative about class against the working classes any more than the middle classes. Well, I looked it up actually the other day, how many people consider themselves middle class in this country, and it's around 59%. But then what does that term even mean?
Right, well, of course, that is up for debate, as always. I mean, Labour's policy to put an end to tax breaks for private schools and use the money to improve standards in the state sector, is that going to be enough, Angela, to actually transform the issue of class?
It's a start to say that when money is scarce, when the opportunity cost of having these kinds of tax breaks is that you're helping 7% of people who are already very privileged, when you could actually be putting that money to help 93% of people who are in ordinary state schools, when after all, I mean, if you look... the funding for education now per pupil in 2024, after the increases announced in the autumn statement, will still be 3% less than it was in 2010. So less and less money per head is being going into the state sector, and yet the private sector has got these tax breaks.
Well, hang on there, but I mean, Keir Starmer was asked about the issue of abolishing private schools, not just taking away their tax breaks on the Today. No, he was asked about it on the Today programme, and it's been picked up in a couple of the papers. Let's have a listen to him.
I'm not talking about, nor am I interested in, abolishing private schools.
But why not?
Because I think private schools add a huge amount to our country. I think that there are very good private schools, and there's no case for abolishing them. And that's why the argument I've been making is about the tax breaks.
Is he right, Keir Starmer?
No, I think that this policy, the policy of scrapping the charity status, should be considered a transitional step. I don't think there's any legitimate reason to have a tutored education system based on fees and money, other than if you want to have the wealthy able to make the choice to secure their child's place in society. And in fact, I actually think the idea that we should scrap the tax subsidy because their money is scarce, I actually think even if the state sector was flooded with money,
you wouldn't want to reinstate it.
But then if the wealthy are paying a great deal of tax and they're also paying taxes towards state schools while not using them, and then you close down state schools, which I believe educate about 600,000 students in this country, where do you then put them? And schools are already oversubscribed, right?
My argument is that everyone would go to a state school.
Well, I mean,
so then you don't
to be
have
fair,
a private
this
school.
isn't Labour policy.
It's not Labour policy, it's my policy.
I understand, but I mean, I think rather than destroying institutions that some people wish to remain and use,
you can actually repurpose them
what
for
you
the
can
state.
actually do is create some of these opportunity pathways so that you can level up people's opportunities. That's what Labour governments have always wanted.
The reality is that question to Keir Starmer got absolutely to the heart of it. This is economically illiterate virtue signalling. If you want to abolish private schools, then come out and say it. Don't pretend that there's a halfway house that is going to create a load of money that actually isn't sufficient to even cover the number of people that would end up in the state system as a result of this policy.
Why do state schools have to pay business rates when public schools don't? I mean, it seems to me that equalising the treatment of that is the minimum that you could do. There are a range of things that you can do to improve people's opportunities and life chances. And early years education, proper funding of education, making certain that those that don't have their own money in the family can have access, like I did when I was growing up.
Well, hang on,
to university is really, really important.
Yeah, but Matt, is it fair? Is it fair that any taxpayer's money goes to private schools?
Well, I think what the current system does is acknowledge that private schools do a great deal of public good, and some of that is in the sense of taking the burden off the state system.
Destroying our economy.
Some of it is in the
the private school system also gave Labour Harriet Harman. I mean, she went to St Paul's Girls' School. It's like one of the best schools in the country.
But actually,
it produced Dame Kate Bingham, who has come out with the vaccine task force. I mean, why is it seen as a black mark against private school that it's produced some pretty successful pupils?
Dahlia?
Because it's an engine to make sure that only a certain sector of society can go on to occupy those positions. There is no reason. Actually, I have a great quote here. Which says, which basically says, are the children of the rich intrinsically more talented and worthy, more gifted and more deserving of celebration than the rest, or of course not, but our state-subsidised private schools continue to give them every possible advantage. That's from Michael Gove in 2017, and I have to say, I completely...
But some might regard this talk as levelling down, not levelling up, to quote Gove.
It's about levelling everyone so that they have the same start in life.
Well, has Dahlia convinced you, Angela? Has she convinced you to be more radical?
I'm always interested in Labour being more radical. I'm interested in the output of that radicalisation. Let's just look at the unfairness at the moment. 65% of the current cabinet were privately educated. 7% of people go to private schools. There's a massive over-representation of people that have groupthink and similar attitudes to things. And we've got to get in amongst that. If you look at the shadow cabinet, it's 15% of shadow cabinet are actually educated in public schools. So we've got to get more voices, more life experiences, more opportunities for people who've been shut out. And that traditionally what a Labour government
candidates, to be fair, Angela. There could be too many people from Oxford in politics, couldn't there?
But let me put this to Matt Orwin, because you mentioned the clash. We showed it in the headlines between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. And the Prime Minister accused Keir Starmer of attacking the hard-working aspiration of millions of people like his parents. I mean, is the Prime Minister saying if you don't send your children to a private school, you lack aspiration?
No, he's not. I don't think he's saying that at all. But what I think he's clearly saying is that Labour is seeking to use this as a proxy for a very different kind of attack. They're trying to raise the issues that they think are electorally interesting about the Prime Minister. And that is the nature of politics. But I'd rather they were honest about what they were trying to do rather than trying to come up with what I say is clearly economically illiterate are at virtue signals.
Let's have a look at this headline in The Observer. Cumbria coal mine plan is backward step, says Alok Sharma. Alok Sharma, president of COP26, the climate conference. We can also have a look at a tweet from him that says opening a new coal mine will not only be a backward step for UK climate action, but also damage the UK's hard-won international reputation through our COP26 presidency as a leader in the global fight against climate change. A government decision is expected this week about whether or not to open this new coal mine. It's been hugely controversial. Let's talk to Mike Starkey. He's the Conservative Mayor of Copeland. He joins us from Whitehaven in Cumbria. Why do you want to open a coal mine?
Well, first of all, the massively positive economic impact it's going to have on my area and for my community. You know, this mine will bring with it 500 direct jobs and 1,500 jobs in the supply chain. It's £160 million worth of private investment, and it will really make a huge positive difference to people's lives, and it will give this community an opportunity to diversify its economy, which is very much nuclear focused at the moment, and give real opportunities, and hopefully, you know, help us retain some of the young people and attract new people into the area.
When would these jobs actually come on stream if the decision to give it the go-ahead happens?
Well, certainly over the next 18 months, we'll see a steady flow of jobs coming in. You know, these are real jobs. They're ready-to-go jobs. You know, you spoke about this mine being controversial. You know, there should be no controversy around it. You know, this is pretty much a no-brainer that this should go ahead. It's been approved on 3 separate occasions by the planning panel.
Yes.
Everybody's had every opportunity on both sides of the argument to make the case, and on every opportunity it's been recommended, and I'm very, very confident that the planning inspector, the independent planning inspector, will also have recommended approval. OK. I mean,
what do you say to Alok Sharma, who says it's going to undermine our international standing on climate change when the UK, as he says, has done so much work to consign coal to history?
I think his comments are absolutely ridiculous. You know, what we've got is what we should be doing is promoting everything that we have done in terms of climate change, because among the leading economies in the world, we have led the way. You know, as a country, the United Kingdom are only responsible for 1% of the total world's emissions. And in terms of coal, thermal coal, which is burned for energy, that will be phased out by the end of 2024 completely. But coking coal, which is for the manufacture of steel, is in huge demand. It's on the EU's critical list of raw materials, and it's better mined here in the most modern, environmentally friendly mine ever constructed and shipped around the world from other places.
Well, listening to that, do you think it should go ahead?
Well, I find it very hard to understand an argument that says when we're going to be using this coal...
So you think it should be
then we should be importing it rather than making it here. I understand Alok Sharma's argument about what signal does it send, but ultimately this seems to me to be a lower carbon footprint and an economic benefit. So I struggle to understand the environmental argument or the economic one against it.
Angela, should it be open?
I mean, looking at all of this, it looks like only 15% of this coal is going to be actually used in this country. The rest of it is for export. And on the steel industry, they actually want clean energy.
Sure.
They don't want to use coal. And the head of their governing body has just said that there's no demand for this mine whatsoever. They want to be building new green steel using hydrogen and various other power. They don't want this coal.
Mike?
Yeah, they want to go ahead and not use coal, but we're decades away from that being viable. You know, the reality is this country is increasing imports of coal. The demand for this coal worldwide is going up because the demand for steel is going up. So, you know, we have imported significantly more coal in the last 12 months than we did in the previous 12 months. So the demand is clear and obvious.
Yeah.
And, there's, you know, if we're going to have the green industrial revolution, which we all want to see, with solar, wind, wave, and up here nuclear, we're going to need significant amounts of steel.
Right. Well, what about the jobs? I mean, are you saying, Angela, that it's not going to create the jobs that Mike has clearly set out?
And actually, sustainable jobs. What we actually need is a transition to green energy and a transition to energy that helps us deal with the climate crisis, rather than making it worse. The steel industry in this country don't want this coal. They've made that quite clear during all of these arguments. So why not actually invest in cleaner, greener energy and get jobs going in something that can be long-lasting? For example, onshore wind.
Well, let me just go back to... I mean, what about local support? How much support is there for this locally?
Massive. It's, you know, I would suggest 90% of the people in the local area support this mine. You know, and I'm thinking of the Labour voters right across Copeland and West Cumbria listening to Angela must be, you know, cringing with embarrassment that the Labour Party are rallying against significant jobs and significant economic improvement here in West Cumbria.
Well, we'll have to imagine them. We'll have to imagine them cringing at this point. But I mean, devolution, which is what Keir Starmer was talking about yesterday. I mean, perhaps these sorts of decisions should be devolved.
But the issue is on climate change and the issue on our international obligations and the fact that we need to have a green prosperity plan. We've got to invest in that. It's no good investing in older technologies with jobs that are not going to be sustainable because of where we are with the fight against climate change. It's really, really important that the money that we've got to invest, we invest in future clean, green energy for jobs in areas.
Just before I come to you,
elsewhere.
I mean, it's a retrograde step, though, isn't it? I mean, the signal is not just a signal; it's a fundamental point. I mean, that's being made about which way this country is going.
Well, I think there's no one who disputes that this is a transitional phase. No one wants to be doing this in the long term, but it is
the jobs aren't sustainable.
Well, no, I mean, it depends on. We're talking about decades as a process, so these are jobs that will be there for decades. It's a transition. I think this seems like an obvious thing where we have to be able to say we have an ambition and this is a step on that road.
Dahlia?
This is a deep political failure. Because the industry, employers and workers have been waiting for the government to produce a business strategy that creates a managed transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to a green economy. And out of lack of political will, expertise, the government has not produced that. And so that is why. And they're using this false opposition between jobs and action on climate change to conceal their own incompetence.
What would happen with green jobs, Dahlia? I mean, people talk about green jobs, but where are they, these green jobs?
There are so many jobs in a just transition, which is a transition that puts workers' rights at the heart. Especially workers in fossil fuel industries have a lot of expertise that can be redeployed in these industries, and they're very open to it. Over 80% of offshore oil workers said that they would be open to leaving the industry. And one final point I want to make is that a lot of these oil and gas and fossil fuel jobs are not good quality jobs. They're precarious, they are not high waged, and so actually this is an opportunity to not only transition to an economy that is not going to destroy our sustainability and that is sustainable, but to actually produce jobs that are good quality, well unionised,
the political argument
rights
aside,
with good employment.
I think the political argument and the lack of planning is one thing, but because it is a transition, Mr. Starkey makes a good point, doesn't he, about needing something in the interim in order to fuel, literally, the building of the steel to then build the new non-fossil reliant industry.
This coal is not appropriate for the steel industry.
Yeah, exactly.
But also, I think that I understand the concern because historically workers have been left behind in these kinds of transitions, like, for example, with deindustrialisation. But this isn't an answer.
Well, let me get this from Mike, because these green jobs you talk about, would they be in your area, Mike? I mean, do you accept Dahlia's argument in terms of having...
Not at all. It's, you know, this mine's been rumbling on now for 7 years since it was, you know, it was first came on the anvil. And, you know, the Friends of the Earth and other protesters against this mine have been speaking about these green jobs that we could have instead. Well, 7 years down the line, the number of those green jobs that's actually happened is a round figure of 0.
All right, Mike.
Over the last 7 years, not one of those jobs has been created.
On that note, Mike, I'm going to have to stop you, but thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to all of my guests for joining us today on the programme. I'll be back tomorrow for PMQs at 11:15.